Most health podcasts will tell you that if you want to lose weight, get healthier, improve your gut health, all those good things, that late night chocolate binge you have every evening, that needs to stop. But not me. I'm here to tell you, you need to eat more chocolate. Double down on it. Scoff till your heart's content. Well, sort of. Chocolate can actually be a health food. It's fiber-rich, full of polyphenols, and rich in taste. But sadly, not that £1 or $1 chocolate bar that you've been picking up from the supermarket sweets aisle. For a healthy bar that's good for your gut, that's the job of craft chocolate. I'm Dr. Karan, an NHS surgeon, and in this podcast, we cut through the BS of modern health advice and tackle the biggest issues in science and medicine. Spencer Hyman is the co-founder and chair of chocolate at Cocoa Runners. He's a craft chocolate and flavor nerd. He's also a historian, and in this episode, he shares the evolving connection humans have had with the cocoa bean over the centuries. We also chat about the ins and outs of chocolate's health benefits and why they're stripped out of ultra-processed bars. The science of flavor, taste, and texture, whether 70% dark chocolate is really healthier than milk, and why toxic heavy metals have been showing up in some supermarket bars. I also get the chance to taste a collection of artisanal chockies a little bit later for science, of course. Yum. Well, brilliant to finally have you here, Spencer, and I can't believe we're dedicating an entire episode, maybe even we should dedicate an entire season, to chocolate.
Yes, no, well, thank you. And I'm a huge fan of your wonderful podcasts, learning all sorts of things about different diets, running, the works. It's been brilliant. It's just been an absolute cornucopia and delight. So it's great to be talking chocolate with you.
No, absolutely. And I think people have this dogmatic view of chocolates that it's unhealthy, but it's kind of like saying bread is unhealthy. There are so many different types of bread and flours you can use, similar to chocolate. There are so many ways to make chocolate, different ways to ferment it. And even one of my favorite topics, the microbiome and microbes, even that has a role to play in how chocolate turns out. And in fact, the microbes we have and how we might interpret the flavor of chocolate. So, I don't know anything about chocolate more than, how it tastes and percentages, but how does chocolate go from a cacao seed to what we see in the supermarket, for example? What's the process behind that?
So the answer is it's a little bit complicated, but you might be able to see in the background some pictures of what are called theobroma cacao, which is cocoa trees. So cocoa is a fruit. It grows in pods, which spurt out the trunk of trees, which is slightly strange. It doesn't really grow off the branches. It sort of pops out. But anyway, it's a fruit. It grows in pods. And somewhat bizarrely, the thing that we eat is actually not the fruit, not the pulp, but we actually eat the seeds, which makes it a little bit rare. And they generally get fermented, and then they will get dried, and then they will get shipped somewhere else where they will get roasted and then ground. And then there's some wonderful technical terms like conching, which basically means grinding to a very, very fine level. And then they get molded into chocolate bars. And that's the sort of process. So it's mainly grown by smallholder farmers. And it's unfortunately mainly processed by big chocolate in big factories in a slightly different way. And unfortunately, in most cases, the primary ingredient in most mass market confectionery or most chocolate is, and this is where the unhealthy bit comes in, is sugar.
So you mentioned that we're eating the seed, and typically when we're thinking about other fruits, we generally don't like the seed components of it. Where does the rest of the plant go? The fruit and the pulp aspect, where does that go? And can that be turned into chocolate or any other edible substance?
No, that's a great question. And actually there's I'm going to take a slight quick sort of diversion here and actually sort of tell you how we figured out how to ferment cocoa seeds into beans. Because actually, if you've ever been to a cocoa farm, which is a fantastic place to go to, but you'll basically discover that there's this delicious pulp as you're getting at, this delicious fruit, and these incredibly bitter and astringent seeds. So one of the great mysteries is, how do we work out how to turn these seeds into rather tasty fruits through fermentation? And the answer probably, we now believe, is that a long time ago, 3,500 BC, some people living in modern-day Ecuador, Peru, and Colombia worked out that you can make a light alcohol, a beer called chicha, out of that pulp. And as a byproduct, you turn those rather bitter and astringent seeds into a far more nutritious and tasty bean, but through the process of fermentation. And to answer your question, most of the pulp is actually used in that fermentation process. Although increasingly now, there are more and more people who are trying to do innovative things with the pulp. So, for example, it's being turned into a drink, it's being turned into a sweetener, etc. But you've got to be a bit careful not to sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater there, because the most valuable bit is still the beans.
And obviously, these beans, the process of fermentation using naturally occurring wild yeasts and bacteria, maybe on the farmer's hands, in the boxes, and in the environment. Are we then to say that depending on where the sort of chocolate is produced and the cocoa is sourced from, there's different environmental microbes? So actually the actual type of chocolate that can be sourced from different places is wildly different because of the type of microbes specific to that local environment?
Yep, you're absolutely right. Spot on. So it's in that sense, cocoa is this wonderful product, fruit, which basically it's sort of got the best of everything, from wine to beer to bread, in the sense that, basically we can play with all those different ingredients. So just in the same way that beer guys play with lots of different yeasts, and that gives them a huge amount of flavor, we do the same with cocoa. But as you quite rightly pointed out, it's basically natural yeasts in the air and natural microbes which kick that process off. But it's also a question of, for example, how long you allow the fermentation to go for, how much oxygen you allow in, because that changes the heat, etc. And there are even people now doing some fairly wacky things, like actually adding other fruits into the end of the fermentation. So there's a wonderful Taiwanese company called Fu Wan who do this with lots of different teas, for example, and beer yeasts. And they're fascinating to taste. So I have to send you some afterwards.
Oh, that'd be brilliant. I'll be right in time for Christmas. And I just wanted to pick up on something you mentioned there. You mentioned the phrase big chocolate. And for people listening to this, we're not talking about supersized chocolate that you can buy, similar to big tobacco, big alcohol, and all of these large commercial industrial companies which produce various foods or beverages, whatever. You have big chocolate who are presumably mass producing chocolate is what you're referring to. What is the difference between something produced on that industrial mass scale, whether it's milk chocolate, white chocolate, or dark chocolate, which is purportedly healthier and has benefits, compared to maybe more artisanal craft chocolate? What is the difference?
The aim of craft chocolate is really twofold. It's to focus on flavor, and it's to be as transparent as possible. And it involves a completely different approach to what we call mass-processed big chocolate. So big chocolate is basically all around cost and consistency. And the way it works is radically different, because what they're trying to do is get you to eat as much as you possibly can, and also to try and make that as cheaply as you possibly can. And the way they do it is almost all chocolate, at least in West Africa, which is where 70% of the world's cocoa comes from, and much of it from South America, which is where most of the rest of the world's chocolate comes from, is actually grown by small farmers. So you've got, literally millions of them in a place like Ghana or the Côte d'Ivoire, which is where most of the chocolate comes from. But they sell to a very, very small number of companies, the big chocolate cocoa processors. Literally, for example, Ghana has maybe 20 customers who it sells all of its chocolate to. And of those, 3 account for 70, 80% of all of its sales. And these are companies that most of us won't have heard of. They're the big cocoa processors. They're people like Calabo. They're people like Cargill. They're people like Olam. And what they do is they basically process this bean into, first and foremost, into cocoa butter, and as a byproduct of that, some cocoa mass. But some of it they do also process just straight into chocolate. And then what they do is they sell it to the big chocolate companies that everybody's heard of, so the Hershey's, the Mars, etc. So there's this sort of, the big chocolate is these sort of 2 different groups. On the one hand, it's the processors, which nobody really is that aware of. And then it's all the big mass market chocolate makers who you probably have heard of. But they are generally working at arm's length through these big chocolate processors who are buying from the small farmers. And they're crafting it, although they're not really crafting it, they're making it a completely different fashion.
And in terms of the craft chocolate, how does this process bypass these big industrial level processors and then those kind of bigger companies that we've heard of like Mars or Hershey's? What is the difference in that process which makes it maybe more beneficial and maybe more expensive for the same reasons?
Yeah, no, it is definitely more beneficial, and unfortunately it is a little bit more expensive, although I still think it's a great deal. So the fundamental approach for craft chocolate is, just as if you want to get, fantastic wine, you have to go to individual vineyards and you want to sort of, figure out how you're getting the ripest grapes and everything like that. It's the same with chocolate. So what happens is, on both sides, you've got small family firms. So the average craft chocolate maker is very small. they're basically husband and wife, or maybe sort of father and daughter or something like that. And they are working through some small intermediaries with cooperatives or directly with small farmers to source the very best beans they can. They pay far more for those beans. So instead of, for example, for most of the 2020s, cocoa prices were basically, $2,500 a ton. Craft chocolate makers will be buying craft chocolate at anywhere between $5,000 to $15,000 a ton. So far, far more. They'll be paying directly. They'll be having much longer contracts. And they're paying for premium quality. And what they're trying to do is pull out the flavor of those beans. And they produce in very small batches in a completely different way. The irony of chocolate is that most people think that it comes from beans, and ultimately it all does come from beans. But most people who claim to be making chocolate in the UK actually never really see a bean. What they're actually doing is they're buying the equivalent of sort of like a ready meal. They're buying this stuff called kubacha, which is basically mass-produced liquor, which has already been made, processed in, for example, Holland, or more likely than not, actually now in West Africa, where it will be remolded and remelted and turned into chocolate bars. So it's a radically different process of basically small batches of craft chocolate beans being turned into that by makers. And on the other hand, basically just taking the equivalent of ready meals and reheating them, if you like. So that's unfortunately how most mass-produced chocolate is made, and all sorts of additives are put in to give it flavor, because otherwise it wouldn't have very much. Lots of sugar is put in to sort of get you to scoff lots of it, etc.
If we break down chocolate into its very basic essence, it's a bean, so it has fiber. It's fermented, so it has those sort of prebiotic gut health benefits. It's rich in polyphenols, these sort of antioxidant compounds, and all of these, flavonoids, which are supposedly having these cardiovascular benefits, maybe central nervous system benefits, brain benefits, etc., gut health benefits, and in that spectrum of chocolates, maybe the more craft version retains most of these beneficial things, the fibers, the polyphenols. And at the other end, that mass-produced stuff, which is using that ready meal version, the kubachuk, you said, is devoid maybe of fiber and strips some of the polyphenols away in that processing, stages. So actually, when someone goes into the supermarket and wants to buy healthy chocolates, and looks at something in the supermarket aisles, they're immediately thinking, okay, I'm going to go for something that's dark chocolate. Beyond just the percentage, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about what the percentage speaks to, what is someone looking at in a supermarket to know, okay, this is the real stuff that's going to have the most amount of benefits in terms of fiber, polyphenols, antioxidants, and all the good stuff we associate with, real natural chocolate?
With the cocoa bean, which is this amazing sort of superfood, super healthy food, etc. So I think if we sort of step back and we say, so how can it be healthy? I think the first thing which should make it healthy is that chocolate has got more complexity of flavor than just about anything else on the planet. So I'm often arguing this with my mates in coffee or with cheese or with wine, I think, but chocolate has got amazing flavor, and it's extraordinary how it releases flavor. And I think its first health benefit is to actually move you from scoffing to savoring. So I hope a bit later we're going to talk about your second stomach and why you should always have room for a piece of chocolate. Yeah. But there is this extraordinary ability that humans have, even if we think we're very full, if we see something which is sweet at the end of a meal, because as you were mentioning, in your intestines, you also have taste receptors in particular for sweetness, you will start to speed up your process of digestion, which is why when you see the chocolate cake coming out, you suddenly think, even though I'm full, I can actually find room for it. You shouldn't really necessarily have the chocolate cake. What you should really have is just a little bit of craft chocolate, because that will help you savor and it'll get all the benefits from it. But I do think this savoring versus scoffing is the first angle to go for. And then I think the second bit, you've sort of hit at lots of these different sort of, angles as to why chocolate is so interesting and why it's so powerful. So one of them is the bioavailability of the fiber in it. And chocolate does have a huge amount of fiber, as you alluded to, as you know. But the question is to how do you optimize the bioavailability there? And unfortunately, what seems to be happening with mass-produced chocolate, and I'm being careful to say seems here because there aren't a lot of studies on it, but there are two steps in the process which appear to be damaging the fiber component. So the first one is basically the way that most chocolate is made. So 3 out of every 4 cocoa beans basically end up being squeezed to death in a mass, in basically what's called the cocoa press, where they're squeezed so that some of the cocoa butter is squeezed out and you're left with the cocoa mass. Now that mass processing, that hydraulic press seems to damage the fiber. So it's a little bit like if you basically have a handful of almonds and you eat those, you get far more fiber, it's far more bioavailable than if you basically have crushed almonds. And that seems to be true of chocolate. Then the other angle is basically how long the roast is for and what happens with the roast. Now, it's not entirely clear exactly what's happening there, but there seems to be some evidence that basically the bioavailability is damaged a little bit by the roasting that you've got. So from a fiber angle, what you really want to do is you want to avoid chocolate which is made out of mass processed liquor or couverture on the one hand, and on the other hand, you don't want to have a high roast. And those two tend to be what you get in, unfortunately, most supermarket chocolate. And what you really want to do if you're looking at a chocolate bar is there are sort of 3 or 4 hints that you can get. So the first hint is basically to look at the ingredients. And if you see a chocolate bar where the primary ingredient is not where the cocoa beans are or the chocolate component, be very dubious. And if it's sugar, be really, really dubious. I mean, often big chocolate's quite good at sort of like, listing as an ingredient, sort of stuff like milk and sugar put together, which confuses you a bit, but there's that. And if you see all sorts of vegetable fats and oils and that sort of stuff, probably not a great sign. The next thing to look at is actually where the beans come from. And by that, I don't mean literally just the country, because big chocolate's got quite smart. So it will now sort of say, well, this comes from West Africa or it comes from Peru or anything. It's like buying a good wine. You actually want to know literally the name of the farmers or the name of the cooperative where you're getting it from. And then thirdly, it's where it's made. So bizarrely, I know we're no longer in the EU, but under EU regulations, chocolate was one of those weird products which actually didn't have to say where it was made because it was a bit tricky to figure out, well, do you mean by that where you made the liquor, which is then remolded, or do you mean where the remolded stuff was made into chocolate? So if you buy a bar of supermarket chocolate, most often you will not see actually where it's been crafted or where it's been made. So look for those 3 different angles. And just to go back to some of the other health benefits, which I think are fascinating. I mean, I think that theobromine, which is the stimulant inside chocolate, there is a bit of caffeine too, as you know, is sort of one of those, it's an amazing vasodilator. So, it used to be given to asthmatics. So it does have all sorts of other benefits. It's got all sorts of trace and rare minerals and metals too, which are very good for you. And again, it looks as if the crafting of chocolate keeps those benefits, but the mass production definitely seems to throw some doubts into it.
I came across theobromine actually a few years ago. I didn't know it was in chocolate until then because I always wondered why dogs couldn't eat chocolate. And then I investigated further and I realized it was mainly this theobromine, which is toxic to dogs. And then on further investigation, I found that actually it has some sort of psychoactive stimulatory effect similar to what caffeine would do and has that action on the nervous system, maybe even some sort of psychedelic effect, which is maybe why the Aztecs and Mayans loved it so much. They loved their psychedelics. But I think I came across a really interesting study. It was over 10 years ago in the journal BMC. It was a meta-analysis, and basically it suggested that dark chocolates, over 70%, specifically over 70%, had an impact on blood pressure readings. So it reduced, on average, the systolic blood pressure, the number on the top of the blood pressure chart, by around 4 points, and the bottom number, the diastolic, by 2, which may not seem like a huge amount, but actually clinically, that's a decent reduction in blood pressure for hypertensive individuals just by eating chocolate on a regular basis. But specifically, in case anyone thinks I can just eat any old chocolate any day and have these benefits, it comes to, again, those specific, amounts of less processing, having that high amount of, cocoa in, which means it retains the fiber, which is likely to be the driver of all of these health benefits, in addition to all the polyphenols, which will probably come hand in hand with the fiber. And what I wanted to ask is, someone inherently might think, listening to this conversation, that actually the most healthy chocolate will be dark chocolate. And, that is the case. But why is it that we can't just say that all dark chocolate is healthy? And also, just to play devil's advocate, can you get milk chocolate or white chocolate, which is healthy?
Let's try and figure out what we mean by dark chocolate and what we mean by 70%. And then let's answer the milk question too. So one of the stranger things is that lots of supermarket dark chocolates are not suitable for vegans. And the reason for this is that they use to improve mouthfeel and to basically bulk them out, everything from like sort of buttermilk through to whey powder. They don't use whey powder anymore because that's now quite expensive, but they'll use all sorts of sort of dairy offshoots. And so, often what you'll see as a dark chocolate actually is not suitable for vegans. Now, craft chocolate's very different. What we mean by dark chocolate is just cocoa beans with some sugar. So I think let's hold on to that bit as the sort of the first thought. I think the second thought is that it's really why you use sugar. So sugar is an amazing substance. It's an extraordinary preservative. It's also highly addictive, and it's pretty cheap. So it's not that surprising that it is the primary ingredient in lots and lots and lots of chocolate. But for craft chocolate, the reason why sugar is so interesting is that sugar seems to act as a flavor enhancer. So what happens with craft chocolate is that a little bit of sugar will bring out all sorts of different flavors. And peculiarly, we actually have some chocolates which are basically, so for example, we've got some chocolates from Brazil, a fantastic company called Luisa Abrams, and she produces 81% and 70% of the same beans. And for very many people, actually, they will think that the 80% is sweeter than the 70%. And it'll have a different flavor profile. And what's happening here is that the sugar somehow works with the different flavor volatiles, which are coming from your polyphenols, and it brings out different aromas which you sense as you taste them. So the sugar in craft chocolate is basically all around trying to reveal and enhance different flavors, not to try and get you jumped on eating lots of it, because that's what we all want to do. Milk chocolates are really fascinating. So again, if you sort of take a chocolate bar, and you think about, well, how much sugar is there in it? So if you take a 70% chocolate bar, it's going to have 2 to 3 teaspoons of sugar in it. Now, you won't eat a whole dark chocolate bar in one go for a start, but that's basically, like if you compare that to a low-fat vanilla yogurt, that's got 7 or 8 teaspoons of sugar in it, and a can of Coke's got like 16. So it's a very different ballgame. Interestingly, a dark milk chocolate, which is basically we define as being anything which has got about 50% cocoa in it, actually often has less added sugar to it than many dark chocolates, because you're using the milk as a sweetener. And in fact, Zotter and Geordie's both do some dark milk chocolates which have got no added sugar, 70% and 80%, which are delicious flavors. And you get all these sort of caramelly notes because you're basically caramelizing the milk. So obviously milk has got sugar in it, but it's not added refined sugar.
I think when you talk about these different, flavor profiles, it makes me think of a lot of interesting studies done by Professor Charles Spence, who's a psychologist out of the University of Oxford, and how our experience of food is not just limited to smell and taste. And he famously did these Pringles experiments where he essentially used the addition of audio to enhance the crackle and the snap and the crispy nature of a Pringles to enhance the flavor as well. So if a Pringles was sounded a bit more crackly, that was deemed or perceived as more fresh, for example. And I guess this also counts towards chocolates, just beyond, I guess, looking at the percentages of the cocoa and whether it's bitter, just how it's presented, how it smells, how it feels, the mouthfeel you've mentioned a few times, the percentage of fat, sugar, all of these have a role to play in not just taste and smell, but maybe how it feels in our hands, how slippery it might feel, how it actually feels kinetically on our mouths. And I came across something very interesting. I think, again, Charles Spence was working with someone who was producing chocolates in Belgium, and the 80% dark chocolate they used, when the customers were eating the dark chocolate with a flute playing, noticed that the chocolate tasted creamier and sweeter. But they noticed when a violin was playing, it tasted a little bit more bitter. Now, I don't know the underlying reason which underpins that neurology or whatever, or psychological behavior. But for me, it just sort of speaks to how, again, going back to your point where when we look at maybe something processed like a, Tony Chocolonely or a Cadbury's chocolate, we tend to want to devour the whole thing without experiencing the journey of that chocolate, for want of a better phrase.
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely spot on both different things. So the first thing I think you're referring to is something called cross-modal. And if I may, I'm actually going to, at some point, take advantage of your beard, because there is another great way of actually using your beard, not only to explain the history of chocolate as to how we moved from drinking it to eating it, which is all to do with your beard. But the other angle to it is that you're absolutely right. Different sounds will make a huge difference to how you perceive food. And one of the best hints you can be given, actually, if you're taking an aeroplane, is because of the noise of an aeroplane, is to actually take noise-cancelling headphones and eat with noise-cancelling headphones on, because it will improve your food. You've also got issues to do with pressure there. But the really interesting games to play here, as well as listening to different musics, for example, are if you stroke something grainy or if you stroke something smooth as you're eating chocolate, it will completely change its flavor profile. But let's just go back, though, to talk about flavor and the magic of chocolate. Because the magic of chocolate really is that nothing releases flavor and has as much flavor potential, I believe, as chocolate. And the reason why I sort of say that is that cocoa butter is this extraordinary substance which is solid when it's properly tempered. It's the right crystal structure at room temperature, but it melts when it goes in your mouth. And not only does cocoa butter have this delicious, delectable mouthfeel, but it also releases aromas and flavors. And that's what makes chocolate just so extraordinarily delicious. And it's really that factor which everybody's trying to replicate. And the reason why, in addition to the fact that 8 out of 10, 8 out of 9 Tony's chocolate only bars are actually the primary ingredient sugar, one of the reasons why most mass-produced chocolate isn't going to have the same flavor release as a great craft chocolate is they will have added often other vegetable fats, palm oils, shea butters, even things like PGPR, because cocoa butter is very valuable, it's very expensive, but it is unique in the way in which it releases flavor. And I think that you're right about thinking about sort of this flavor journey as being, a fantastic human opportunity, which most of us just let us pass by.
I think, if you go back to some of the health benefits of chocolates, I guess you mentioned that a lot of these typical commercial chocolate brands have high amounts of salt, fat, and sugar, or certainly sugar and fat, which I guess is a unholy trinity when it comes to all things ultra processed, because they're designed to be hyper palatable, so we overconsume them, and that's, you could argue, has led to all sorts of adverse health outcomes in a wider, population sense. But I also wonder, a lot of the compounds within chocolate, which are sort of locked away, some of these bioactives, these polyphenols, etc., sometimes, I guess, to become bioavailable, they do need a certain degree of fat and sugar to almost latch onto so we can absorb them effectively. So I guess, it's a necessary devil or necessary evil, as it were. But when it comes to some of these chocolate compounds and people associating chocolate with health benefits, like we've spoken a little bit about the, reduction in blood pressure, maybe heart health benefits, brain benefits, gut benefits, the reason as to why that happens, for example, in the heart, do we actually know the specific reason and the underlying cause? From what I understand, there may be some activation of the nitric oxide pathway because of some of these phenolic compounds, which, does that. And then nitric oxide, as you know, it's produced by the lining of the cells in the blood vessels, which help the blood vessels to dilate, vasodilate, and widen. So the blood flow is improved. And as we age, unfortunately, we lose some of that production of nitric oxide. Is that the most widely accepted theory? And do we have proof of that or any other mechanisms by which they can improve our general health?
Yeah, so I'm going to try and split that into two, if I can, because I'd love to come back to the whole issue about flavor and actually how that can be a tool to improve your health and avoid junk food, and talk more about the bliss point. But I think let's just quickly dive into this heart one, because you're right. There's an awful lot written about it. And as you're very kindly and gently alluding to, there isn't a lot of science behind it. So the story about heart health and chocolate is actually a pretty extraordinary one. It dates back to a guy called Benjamin Keene, who was an amazing American scientist who is responsible for everything from the Shah of Iran being allowed into the States and kicking off the Iranian hostage crisis on the one hand, to on the other hand, as to why pilots in America basically carry shark repellent, because he was the guy who showed that when pilots fell into the water, they did get eaten by sharks and persuaded reasonable to give them shark repellent. He's also the guy who's responsible for basically telling you not to have ice when you go internationally because it can mess up your stomach if you're not used to it. But also in the 1950s, when he was, well, 1940s actually, 50s, he was basically based down at the Panama Canal and came across this group of Indians, indigenous people called the Kuna. And he noted just in his sidebooks that they had amazing heart health. And about 50 years later, a guy called Holtzman in Harvard basically spotted this and was trying to show that there might be something genetic in heart health. And when he spotted these Kuna people, he went down there to go and examine them. And he fairly rapidly discovered that it couldn't be genetic, because when they moved to Panama City, it all got problematic. But then he ran into this idea that it might be chocolate, which is basically helping the heart health. And this is where it all gets a little bit convoluted and a little bit unfortunate, because it turns out that he was basically taking lots of money from Mars. And there are all sorts of studies which basically suggest that somehow or other chocolate is full of flavonoids and it's got really good benefits. You'll hear this word ORAX, which you as a scientist will probably understand. You're already nodding and saying it's a load of absolute nonsense, but that's apparently what it is. And so most of this heart health stuff for chocolate, unfortunately, is very, very dubious. There may well be some heart health benefits from flavonoids. People are still researching it. But in the end, the people who called uncle on this was actually a group of anthropologists who basically pointed out that the stuff that Keane was talking about, this sort of super special cocoa powder, which supposedly these guys were drinking, actually couldn't be the cause of it because it was all wiped out in a blight and a hurricane in the, about 30 years earlier. So it's really clouded, as are lots of things to do with chocolate, unfortunately, in some pretty dubious storytelling. But let me try and put a slightly more positive spin on it, because I think you were hinting at it, which is that I think that one of the things which has happened with junk food is that, as you were sort of suggesting, there are a couple of innovations which really explain why we scoff food, why basically once you pop, you can't stop with Pringles. It's basically down to a couple of really clever discoveries by a couple of scientists. One is Howard Moskowitz. You mentioned that bliss point, sugar, salt, and fat. That's one of them. The other is this idea of sensory-specific satiety. So if you've got different lots of textures and lots of different tastes, you can basically get people just to carry on scoffing. And you can think of lots of foods where you've got all the textures, you just want to keep on going and going and going. Or if you go to an ice cream store, they'll try and get you to have 5 different scoops of different ice creams because you get bored if you just have one. So hold on to that. And then let's think about how we can defend it. So unlike other animals, humans have got this amazing ability to detect aromas with our mouths. So I know that sounds really strange, but what we call flavor is basically the release of volatiles, which we normally would smell, through our mouths, which release those amazing aromas. And only humans can do this. There are a couple of other animals, there's like a deer which can do it, but only humans can do it. And chocolate is brilliant at doing this. So actually, what you really want to try and do is get people used to focusing on flavor and savoring. Because to get a taste like sugar, salt, or fat takes you literally a tenth of a second, if not faster. There's nothing that hits the central nervous system faster than sweetness or bitterness. It's literally, I think sweetness is 3/50 of a second. Compare that to nicotine or caffeine, I think it's way faster. Flavor, however, because the chocolate has got to release its aromas by melting in your mouth, takes 5 to 10 seconds. So you really want to take your time. And this has a lot of advantages because, for one, it slows down your eating. So you won't want to scoff. But it also teaches you just to basically focus on what you're enjoying. You can spot anybody with a minimum amount of focus can actually spot the difference between a junk food and a well-crafted chocolate bar.
I just found that really fascinating how you said that about the sort of differences between flavor and aroma, because how you described it there was almost akin to wine tasting. And the sort of sommeliers, really hold the wine in their mouths and they let those flavor profiles, those, real aromatous compounds and chemicals evaporate and diffuse into their mouth so they can get the taste. And actually, biologically, this makes sense because most of our sense of taste is actually our sense of smell. So, if you hold your nose and you taste something, you probably will get a significantly diminished taste, which is why also during the COVID pandemic, a lot of people who had anosmia couldn't taste anything. And also why if we go on flights, our taste is diminished, partly because our sense of smell is reduced. But also, interestingly, everyone thinks of our sense of smell as just these 2 nostrils, but we've got internal nostrils as well, the posterior nares, which is kind of inside our mouth. So it makes sense to almost keep whatever food you've got in your mouth a bit longer so it can actually trigger the internal nostrils. And I think this is called retrograde olfaction. So you've got the smell from the outside, you hold it on the inside, and it also triggers the internal nostrils, that sense of smell. So you're almost accentuating your sense of smell and ergo your sense of taste.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And let me just add one other sort of interesting observation about how smell and aromas work, which is different to most other senses. So if I look behind you, I can see lots of different books and lots of different colors. And the simple way to think about this is if you look at a rainbow, we can automatically see lots of different colors. Smell and flavor, by which I mean aromas in your mouth, are very strange in that there's something which is called the Lang limit. And even a well-trained sommelier or a well-trained coffee expert or a well-trained chocolate taster you can literally only identify maximum 2 or 3 aromas at any one time. So you want to think about it as a journey because you will get different aromas coming. And some of this is, the fun of basically wine tasting or craft chocolate, savoring, etc. But there are other things to think about as to what's going on inside here and what it's reflecting. And one of them, exactly what you're talking about with retronasal olfaction and the way in which it works, but it slows you down to appreciate it. But also, for example, if you've ever had a cup of hot tea or when it cools down, you will get different flavors. Think about what happens with coffee too. The reason why you get those different flavors is different heats release different aromas. And it's this amazing skill that we all have, but we don't know how to use. So what you said about taste is absolutely right. So basic tastes: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, umami, and fat. And we can almost all instinctively identify those. So you recently had a great episode on running when you basically said, look, anybody can learn to run. And you're right. If you basically give somebody a pair of running shoes and you force them to run for a month, after a week, they're probably not going to love you, but after a month, they are going to really get what you're talking about. Now, I think in a strange way that aromas and flavor is a little bit more like swimming. So if you drop somebody in a pool or a pond every day for a month, after a week, they're going to want to kill you. And after a month, they probably are going to kill you because you have to show them how to do it. And you do need a vocabulary. And that's one of the reasons why these sort of wine wheels or these coffee wheels and everything actually work quite well. But I think they make one mistake, which is they tend to think about it as static, as like a rainbow. And really what I think you want to do is think about it more as a wave. So I'm sort of now holding up this sort of wave thing that we have, which we use, which we developed with Barry Smith and James Hoffman and Rebecca Palmer and other people in the coffee and the wine industries. Because you want to think about flavor as a journey. And just to bring it back to health, as you've been saying, we all know that ultra-processed food is not good for us. So what do we do about it? Well, you can check the ingredients. You can do the Michael Pollan trick. You can look at where it's coming from. You can check how it's been made. But actually, we've got this amazing sense, which only humans have got, which is our ability to detect flavor. You won't get great flavor from junk food because at best, they're going to throw in some synthetic flavor compounds, which aren't going to give you much of a wave. They're not going to have the 400, 500 different flavor volatiles that you get in a glass of wine or a craft chocolate bar and a cup of tea or anything like that. And it's that I think we need to get back to. And once we've got people savoring, the world is our oyster and we'll be able to sort of eat more healthily.
Do you think there's a problem with our lexicon when it comes to describing flavor and taste? Because English is not my first language. I was born in Mumbai, so primary languages are Hindi and Tamil. So whenever I'm speaking to my parents in Hindi or Tamil and I'm commenting on food, there are certain descriptions of flavor, even different gradients of spice or bitterness or something, which I don't have a specific English translation for, but inherently I understand what it means in Tamil or Hindi. But if I wanted to tell someone that same thing, I would say, it's more spicy. I don't. It's like an additive word in English. I can't give a unique word to that same word that I can describe in Hindi or Tamil. So is that a problem? Because there was a very interesting behavioral sciences and linguistics talk by I think Dr. Boroditsky, and she essentially said, our language shapes our perception. So even the way we describe things can, essentially, alter our reality. So if we don't have a specific word for a type of flavor, we might not perceive that flavor as strongly.
Yeah, so you're 100% right. And I'd like to sort of dive down 2 different angles on this. So the first angle I'd like to do is actually link it to police lineups. So there's a fascinating concept with policemen called verbal overshadowing, which was identified about 50 years ago, which is that if you ask somebody after a crime has been committed against them to describe the person who committed the crime, and then you show them those words before they go into a police lineup, they are less likely to actually be able to identify the criminal. And the reason for that is they don't have the right vocab and it confuses them further. And there are a couple of people who've done the same thing with wine, where basically forcing somebody to describe wine if they don't have a good vocab for it actually makes it less likely they'll be able to identify the wine. But if you do it to somebody who's trained in wine, it's easy. I think the second point you've come up with, I think is part of the problem here. So I think you clearly come from a family which values food and where the people who do the cooking take great pride in it and the people who receive the cooking also take great pride in it and they want to complement it. So they've learnt the language. And I think that's what happens in a lot of countries. So, for example, craft chocolate is at the moment doing brilliantly well in Thailand because people just get it. They get flavors. They get all the complexity of it. And there are lots of cultures which have got this. Unfortunately, I don't think we have it here in the UK. And I don't think the US has got it either. One of the examples of this is that according to the Food Standards Agency, over 30% of people in the UK do not have a table to sit down and share meals with one another. So if you don't share meals with one another, how do you compare and contrast and talk about the food? So I think that a lot of it is the way that we're brought up. And I think there are lots of countries where basically having that family bringing together and discussing the food really, really helps. And just as a final sort of play on this, we know this is true because of colors. So there are lots of different cultures where, for example, the vocab for colors is very different. And my favorite example of this is Japan, where if you go to Japan and you see the traffic lights, they don't go red, yellow, green. They go red, yellow, blue. Because until 1912, I may have got the year wrong, but until 1912, I think, there was no word for green in Japanese. And even today, Midori, which is the Japanese for green, doesn't have a kanji. I hope I'm correct in that, but that is, I know the red, yellow, green bit from living in Japan is true. That is this sort of very weird bluey green, which they use. And if you don't have a word, you can't articulate it. So you've got to learn to appreciate flavor. But I think that is our secret weapon, or one of our many secret weapons against junk food. And I think that's where chocolate, in a way, is actually so powerful as a tool for getting us to eat healthily, because it will force us to basically think about what we're eating and think about flavor. And flavor is the one thing that big food doesn't know how to play with. It's really good at playing with sugar, salt, and fat, the bliss point. It's really good at sensory specific satiety. It's really good at making stuff addictive. It's really good at great branding and packaging. It's not really good at flavor.
Well, I must admit that, I haven't been introduced to the world of craft chocolate, but you kindly sent me some craft chocolate, and hopefully we can do a bit of a taste
We'd
test.
We'd love to do it.
Begin the journey.
So let's begin the journey, and we'll try and wrap in a little bit of history and have a little bit going there. So show me the bars that you've got, and we'll figure out the order that we're going to have a go at, because you've got 3 or 4, haven't you?
Yeah. So I've got
2 standouts.
Oops.
So what I'd like you to do is to first of all take the so we could basically start with the Menacao, which is the one you've got in your right hand, which is the one with the lady on the front, the salt and nibs. And we're going to first of all use it to describe exactly what you showed, which is, so if you open up that chocolate bar, what I'd love you to do is, there is a right way and there's a wrong way to having chocolate. So if you want to sort of impress everybody at home with how to have chocolate from now on, this is, you can sort of show them that you know what you're doing. So you open up the chocolate bar, and when you've got a piece of it, you're not allowed to eat it quite yet. That's the only thing I will sort of have to beg you to ask.
Open the chocolate bar. So it's,
Okay. And then what I want you to do is to break a piece off.
Whole slab?
Yeah, whole slab will be good. That'll be good. And give it a quick sniff.
Wow.
And you should get a bit of a smell of chocolate in it. Now, one other thing just to sort of show you how heat works is if you take a little bit of that chocolate and you just rub it between your fingers, what you'll discover is that it melts into your fingers. And on top of that, it'll release even more aromas and flavors. And that just shows you how heat releases different flavors.
Wow.
Now, the next thing I want you to do, and this just is a way of checking that the chocolate is properly tempered. Tempering is a technical term just to sort of describe whether it's got the right crystal structure. Take a small piece of it and hold it up to your ear and just snap it. And I'm doing it on top of my microphone just so you can all hear it. But that snap is very important. Then what I want you to do is to empty one hand, and we're going to basically show what you sort of showed at, what you alluded to earlier, which is that if you basically squeeze your nose tightly shut, drop a piece of chocolate on your tongue, and just suck it, you might. Now, this chocolate is deliberately, we've chosen it because it's got a bit of texture to it. It's got some nibs on the outside. It's also got a little bit of salt added to it. Hold on to your nose as long as you can. But what you shouldn't be able to do is get a lot of different flavor coming from it yet. So if you keep holding on to it, you can breathe in and out through your mouth. This is one of the advantages of doing a tasting with chocolate. If you do this with wine and you try and breathe when you've got a mouthful of wine, it's a bit of a mess. But with chocolate, you can do it quite easily. So if you hold on to the chocolate, can you taste anything yet? Maybe a little bit of salt. Okay. If I now ask you to release your nose and pretend you run 100 meters from... What should now suddenly happen is a whole range of different aromas and flavors should suddenly start to wash over you.
Yeah, I got a burst of
So again, it shows exactly what you described, which is your sense of flavor is basically your sense of smell. It's olfactory. You've got two little bulbs up here. It's called retronasal olfaction. And humans are unique. We don't have something called a transverse lamina, which means that when we put something in our mouths, as we breathe in and out, the aromas come back out. And it's that which gives us the sense of flavor. And you're quite right. It is also linked to how we detect taste. We're not quite sure how yet, but that's the reason why it inhibits it. Now, the other thing which is quite fun to try and do is if I now get you to have a small piece of chocolate, and I'm going to get you to do this while I talk, same chocolate, and I basically count to 3, and then I give you 5 seconds to scoff it, what I'm hoping is that you won't get a lot from that. So I'm going to count to 3. I'm going to give you 5 seconds. 1, 2, 3. Go. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Swallow and open your mouth to show me that you finished it. Swallow. No, you're taking much too long. Open your mouth. Okay, there you go. That's perfect. Now, hopefully, other than getting a little bit of indigestion, what can you tell me that you got from that?
It was harder to chew. It was harder to break down. Even a small mouthful was more filling. The taste lingers a lot more, so I can feel the freshness in my mouth. It doesn't feel like I've eaten a chocolate. It almost feels like I've eaten a fruit.
Yeah.
And actually, what I tasted 60 seconds ago has changed in profile sort of every 30 seconds almost. And I feel almost like a cherry flavor now. When I first put it in my mouth, I felt just like a sort of a fatty taste. So, it's changed as time has gone on, which I guess comes to those different aromas and different phenolic compounds and aromatase chemicals being released.
Mixing with your saliva and just being released. Now, if you take another piece of the same chocolate, this is the last time we're going to do it, but you really savor it and you pick up the wave and you first of all think about taste and texture. What I'm hoping now is that you will get a little bit of salt on it. So you're going to detect a little bit of saltiness. You'll be able to get some sweetness. You'll get the texture. That's the first thing that you get. And then exactly as you were saying, because chocolate has cocoa butter, it gradually releases its flavor. It intermingles, sorry, I'm going to use some slightly unpleasant words, but mingles with your saliva. And as you were saying, you then go and get, you were beautifully describing it, all sorts of different sensations. You start to get, effectively, the polyphenols are basically releasing different volatiles. And then what will happen is after about another 15 to 20 seconds, it won't just be heat which is releasing the different aromas. It'll also be enzymes in your saliva which break down what are called bonded volatiles. And so actually not everybody has the same sense of taste. So it's not like color, which everybody should be able to see the same colors unless they're colorblind. Actually, everybody is going to have quite different senses of flavor because they've got different microbiomes in their mouth.
So different enzyme composition, different microbiome composition, different perceptions in terms of, maybe even the density of olfactory receptors or smell receptors in their brain.
Yeah, that definitely is.
Wow.
It's very difficult to research. I mean, ironically, this could well be the last refuge that we have against AI, because AI can't do this because we just don't have a database. Now, what I'd love you just to try and do, just very quickly, just to sort of play with it, just to get you throwing in through some of the other stuff, is you've also got 2 bars from Standout. And very early on, you mentioned that, the thing which gives rise to different complexity of flavor is different beans. Yeah, so I think you've got one from Lachua, which is Guatemala, and then I think you've got another either from Peru or Madagascar, I can't remember. But basically...
Madagascar, yeah.
Madagascar, okay. So one from Bajofo State, one from the Quechua people in Lachua. Open both of them up. Try a small piece of each of them. So chocolate is a bit like a conversation. It's best done in pairs. So basically, you want to always have a couple of different chocolates because it's the compare and contrast. But what we're doing here is hearkening back to the earlier part of the conversation when you were basically saying, how is it you get these different flavors? It's different beans. There are different bean types. It's different yeasts, different fermentation approaches. Yeah. So if you try the Lachua, the Guatemala beans, by the way, which is grown by a group of people called the Quechua, who are the descendants of the very first people we have any records of actually bringing chocolate to Europe in 1544. When
oh, wow. So this is the Guatemalan one?
That's the Guatemalan one.
Was I meant to be eating it or just savoring
it? Yeah, you're absolutely meant to be eating it. You only forgot to do the snap. But only if you want to really impress people that you're now a sort of absolute chocolate sommelier. If you sort of do the snap, everyone will be really impressed.
Equivalent of the swirling.
Yeah, it's the equivalent of the swirling. It's actually a very similar thing. So swirling is meant to sort of release more, put up more oxygen and to give more aromas. And that snap.
Okay. So I'll try the snap with this one. with the apologies for speaking with my mouthful, but with the Madagascar chocolate, I got an immediate hit of flavor, but with the Guatemalan one, I got a more delayed flavor hit.
So I think what you may get with the Madagascar one is actually that it's a little bit, I get sort of citric berry notes, which I often associate with sourness, which is a sort of taste. So what I think is happening here is that they're sort of compounding. It's back to the way in which you were describing how taste and flavor interact. But I hope what you get with both of them is, there's a term that we get from wine, which is BLIC, which stands for balance, length, intensity, and complexity. And basically, all great foods should have a combination of balance, length, intensity, and complexity. They should all take you on a journey. It's very, very different to basically once you pop, you can't stop, junk food and Pringles. But ironically, I actually think that in a strange way, that one of the reasons why chocolate took off in the 19th century was because people worked out how to make the world's first bliss point food, which is actually called milk chocolate. So if you pick up the original beans, Esmeraldas, so if you pick that one open, so that's a milk chocolate. It's got 42% cocoa in it, so it's actually got more chocolate in it than most supermarket dark chocolates, or many supermarket dark chocolates.
So 42%. So this would be, significantly lower than the 70%, which is, I guess, a marker of healthy chocolate.
But it's got a lot of milk in it.
Milk, yeah.
In fact, just as a quick, aside, white chocolate was originally invented actually as a vitamin supplement to get kids to eat milk when they wouldn't drink milk. It's called Nestrovit. And it wasn't until some marketing genius in the UK decided to call it Milky Bars that it started to sell quite well. Before that, it was all called Galat. Now, what should be happening with that chocolate is immediately, it should be quite Moorish.
I got a hit of milk straight away.
Yeah. And you almost probably want to go for another piece.
I preferred the dark one.
That's great. So you obviously, for a lot of people, that's great that you are, you are a flavor nerd, if you like. But that's what I would have sort of predicted from earlier conversations. But for many people, if they love milk chocolate, what's happening here is it is the first bliss point food. It's sugar, salt, and fat.
This really tasted like I can imagine this tasted like the white chocolate vitamin supplements, because it almost had a medicinal taste to it with the amount of milk inside it. It just didn't feel right. But the other darker chocolates, and I guess the dark chocolates, because as often is the case with many bitter foods, these bitter compounds are the plant's defense chemicals, and almost humans are trained not to like these bitter compounds, which is why I guess it really is an acquired taste to learn how to enjoy dark chocolate. And actually, interestingly, you may already know this, but you can actually train your microbes to enjoy dark chocolate because they can adapt and evolve and fluctuate the more you expose them to a certain thing. So if you don't like cruciferous vegetables like broccoli, for example, if you keep exposing yourself to broccoli and eating broccoli, eventually the microbes, both in your gut microbiome and even oral microbiome, will eventually become acclimatized to cruciferous vegetables and those bitter defense chemicals, and you might even enjoy them over time.
Yeah, no, so bitterness is really fascinating. So the weird thing about bitterness is that unlike sweetness, where there's just basically one form of sweetness, bitterness, there's 20 to 30 different forms of bitterness, and not everybody can identify them in the same way. But you are absolutely right. Bitterness and astringency, which is not a taste, it's a chemesthesis, you basically you can train yourself to appreciate and enjoy them. So, a good example of that is that very, very few people, the first time they're given an espresso, will enjoy it. It's too bitter, it's just too astringent. And it's the same thing with 100% chocolate. So I don't know if we've sent you some 100% chocolate, but if we have, one of the great games we can play is to get you to have 100% chocolate. Most people find it very difficult. But then if we get you to chew a coffee bean, which that's the Taza, which is the stone ground, which is the one to be using. That's the one we can use with your beard.
Is it this it?
Yeah, it's that one. That's the 100%. So that's got no added sugar. So that, even you...
Wow, that's a nice snap on that.
Yeah, very well made, Bob. So even for you, that may be quite tricky. It's not the bitterness which is going to do you, it's the tannins which are going to create a sense of astringency. So what's going to happen is that the tannins will basically bind with the proteins in your saliva and cause your mouth to become less slippery. So it dries out. And most people associate astringency and bitterness, so they sort of tend not to like it. But what's strange is that you can definitely get people used to astringency. So red wine, most people find very astringent the first time they have it. Coffee, the same thing. But you get used to it because it has other benefits. You're doing great. You obviously like bitterness and astringency.
You know what? The really funny thing is, I think it does have something to do with ethnicity, because I eat a lot of South Indian food, and a lot of South Indian vegetables are very bitter gourds, things like that.
Oh, yeah,
and
of
often
course.
they're not cooked or processed a whole lot. So a lot of them are pickled. They're sort of cooked with additional bitter compounds, with salt. So actually, you know, for 35 years of my life, I've been brought up on very bitter, very spicy things. So although I wouldn't say I enjoy the taste of this, I'm not put off by it.
And are you also used to astringent foods? So you're clearly used to spicy foods, which is another form of chemothesis. But are you also used to foods which sort of literally pucker your mouth, dry your mouth out?
Oh, yeah. So a lot of the sort of pickled foods, a lot of very sour foods, which really sort of, kind of make your face inadvertently, gurn.
Yeah. So I mean, you are exactly what you were describing earlier on. You can learn to appreciate the complexities within inside that sort of sensation. And I think that's what makes stuff interesting. So, I mean, if I don't get a nice bitter salad or vegetable with my meal, I'm very unhappy. And I will naturally veer towards the dark chocolates. And milk chocolate for me is, I understand why people love it. And if I've sort of, done a long swim, or if I'm very tired, I'll definitely reach for some. But I think you are right that actually you can learn how to do it. It's like learning another language. It's like learning to ride a bike. It's a skill that once you've got is phenomenally valuable and fun. Do you want to try the beard trick?
Oh, yes, please. Yeah.
So the Taza, which is the stone ground chocolate. So there's this weird bit of chocolate's history, basically between the 1840s and the 1870s, when we figured out how to finally make stable, solid chocolate bars. But we didn't understand how to make them very smooth. So if you look at that, and when you crack it, you'll discover that it's a completely different texture to the other chocolates you've got, because it's stone ground. It's not going to be particularly smooth.
Feels like a bit of clay or something, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Earthy, it's sort of like a muddy, sandy.
Yeah, bit of pottery.
Okay, so if you basically savor that. Now, as you're savoring it, what I'd like you to try and do is first of all say, do you like that texture or not?
I don't not like it. It's, sometimes when you have a good bit of pottery and it's really nice and you've got this very unusual, unhinged sensation, you want to just bite into the pottery. That's how I feel right now.
That's how you feel that.
So
okay. Now, let me see if I can change that for you. Could you please stroke your forehead as you're eating the chocolate? Not with the chocolate. Yeah. And now stroke your beard. Not at the same time. Not at the same time.
I got a metallic taste as I started stroking my forehead.
Okay. That's what's known as cross-modal attention. Most people find that it changes the texture, their sensation, because your hands are amazingly tactile. So just as different sounds you associate with different sensations, different touch you also associate. So if you basically have a bubbly drink and you stroke something smooth and then stroke something rough, it may well change your appreciation of that. It's another trick that big food plays on us.
I really like this, by the way.
Taza is phenomenal. It's a wonderful story. It's basically a lovely company set up just outside Harvard.
If I wanted to ask, so if someone in the UK, the USA is going on their supermarket weekly shop, can they come across any of these high quality, beneficial, minimally processed craft chocolates in a typical supermarket like Walmart's, Target, Tesco, Sainsbury, Asda, Lidl, Aldi?
So let me start with the good news. The good news is they're not that expensive. So, if a bar of Green and Blacks, Lindt, Tony's is like £2 or £3. This stuff starts at $4 or $5 or dollars, 4 or 5, and goes up to about 8 or 9. So that's the first bit of good news. The second bit is if you're in the US, Taza, for example, widely available. Fruition, another great brand, widely available. In the US, the most independent supermarkets will be selling good craft chocolate. Now for the bad news. In the UK, it's almost impossible. And I'm afraid Supermarket Finest is not in the same league. Occasionally, you will find a fantastic brand called Willie's in the odd supermarket. If you go to delicatessens, you will often find the likes of people like Chocolada or Pump Street or sometimes even Duffy's. But fundamentally, it is much, much, much harder in the UK to find this sort of chocolate, which is a real shame. So it's something which we're changing. So unfortunately, you've almost got to go online to get it, or come to a tasting, or sort of do both. Unfortunately, it is just very, very difficult. It's not like, there are, I think there's like 5,000 specialty coffee stores in the UK. Unfortunately, there's nowhere in the UK outside of online cocoa runners where you can actually purchase great craft chocolate. In the US, it's slightly different. Even in France, it's a bit different. There are a few stores that you can do it. So sadly not.
So for these benefits of eating good quality dark chocolate, what is the recommended dosage, if we were to say per day for an adult to consume to achieve any benefits from that?
So I think that the benefits are learning to savor and learning to get into flavor. And then you go and get all the rare earth minerals, and you go and get all of the other stuff to it too. So we deliberately set up a sort of discovery service modeled on the idea of, DJs and playlists, whereby we send you it's really designed for a couple or a family, where we send you 4 different bars of chocolate every month. And we encourage you to have a couple of different bars on the go at any time. But I would sort of say, 4 or 5 squares of dark chocolate, maybe a little bit of milk chocolate every now and again, white chocolate every now and again in there too. That's absolutely great. Have it at the end of a meal. It'll aid digestion. Always try and have a couple of different bars of chocolate on at the same time. Always try and share it, because actually sharing it helps you articulate the flavors, just as you did then so brilliantly. But don't scoff a whole bar. I mean, craft chocolate is packaged in such a way that you can reseal the bars, because they don't want you to scoff the whole thing in one go. You don't need very much. When you come to one of our tastings, for example, everybody comes away feeling absolutely full, but they've eaten less than 25 grams of chocolate. They won't have eaten even like half a small bar of chocolate. And because chocolate is amazingly filling. That's one of the reasons why the Aztecs and the Mayans and the Olmecs got into it. And it's one of the reasons why it took off in Europe too. It's an amazingly filling. The Navy used to serve it as rations. It's an amazingly filling food.
Well, yeah, I guess even the Mayans and Aztecs used it, the cacao seeds, as a form of currency until they realized it was highly perishable. But I guess, even though this craft chocolate is more expensive, it kind of makes up for the fact of the cost, because you can savor it and it does last a lot longer than traditional mass-produced chocolate. It's it's going to last a person twice as long, maybe 3 times as long, or even far longer than that. So I guess more people should be trying to figure out this sort of journey with dark chocolate, and they maybe never even considered trying dark chocolate because they've heard it's too bitter, or they're trying to, I guess they've been brainwashed by big chocolate into thinking something can only be good if it's hyper palatable and be consumed in mass quantities. So I really hope people do give dark chocolate more of a go. One concern I guess a lot of people may have, and this might be more fear-mongering and I guess blown up as an issue because of social media and traditional media, but the issue around heavy metal contamination in chocolates, and specifically dark chocolate. So what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, no, so you really are very much on the point with that one. So the heavy metals issue in chocolate is very interesting. So there have been a bunch of different reports coming out of the US mainly about levels of cadmium and lead in chocolate. And it's really worth separating those two out. So let's start by talking about the really bad one, which is lead. And I'm not saying cadmium's good for a moment, but let's start with lead. So lead is not a good substance to imbibe in any way. And you know that. That's the reason why we don't have lead paints anymore. We don't have lead pipes, etc. We don't sweeten our wine with lead either. It is not a good thing to have anywhere in your food. Now, unfortunately, it can enter chocolate. And it generally enters chocolate through, for want of a better expression, poor processing. What I mean by that is that after chocolate's been fermented, it needs to be dried, because otherwise it'll go moldy. The cheapest way to dry it in a sunny climate is literally to leave it on the road. The problem with drying it on the road as opposed to beds is that as the trucks go by, you will get loads and loads and loads of diesel fumes. And this is one of the ways that we believe that mass-produced chocolate has got this problem with lots of lead in it. Craft chocolate, if you would never dream of basically drying it on the roads and letting the lead into it in that way. So that's really not an issue there. So the lead in chocolate is really just a consequence of it being poorly processed. So that's sort of issue number one. Cadmium is a very different problem. Cadmium is obviously another form of poisoning. People sort of know about it because sort of, the famous painters, I think it was Toulouse-Lautrec or Van Gogh basically, made those amazing yellow paints and orange paints and sort of sucked the stuff and gave themselves cadmium poisoning. And it's a pretty nasty thing to get. So cadmium is in lots and lots and lots of fruits and vegetables. So, for example, it also is present in kale and lots of other stuff. It is not particularly present in chocolate, but it is still a problem. The weird thing about cadmium is that, unlike lead, this is one which actually grows into the cocoa. So what happens is depending on the soil and depending on the age of the cocoa tree, it is possible that in certain countries, mainly Latin America, South America, so Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, there have been some recorded instances of cadmium in some of the beans. Now, it can be treated. You can treat the soil, et cetera, than that. But it is a problem. Everything now that craft chocolate will do will be tested. So it is extensively tested. And we've also had the bars tested. There's been no problems with that, etc. I would also sort of say, though, that cadmium in particular is a problem because of the half-life. So it's particularly a problem for children. It's not such a problem for older people. It's also hugely influenced by what you've eaten before. I personally don't think that it's that much of a danger, the cadmium issue. It's not nearly as worrying to me as is the lead issue. The lead issue really is a big problem, and it harkens back to a real processing problem. It's just basically cheap commodity chocolate. They don't pay enough for it to be properly dried. It's going to be in there. Cadmium, yes, it's a problem, but there are a lot of foods which got a lot of cadmium in them. And if you wanted to ban chocolate with cadmium in it, you'd also be banning all sorts of green vegetables too. So I get more worried about the lead one. But it is an issue. We've written about it extensively. It's definitely something worth watching. But it's much more of a problem for mass-produced chocolate than it is for craft chocolate. And I think that sugar is, the really lethal thing in most chocolate.
I think another thing I wanted to sort of just flag up, a lot of people, when they're buying chocolate or buying any produce in the supermarket, they often see the label fair trade. And this somehow implies that, it's economically more viable for the farmers and the people who are at the front line producing this in some way. But I've noticed a lot of the chocolates, well, all the chocolates you've given me don't have the fair trade label. So what is really behind that phrase, fair trade, and does it mean much?
Yeah, so fair trade is a hugely complicated issue. Wow, these are good questions. So fair trade is a hugely complicated issue. So look, I'm a huge fan of fair trade. What it's trying to do, try and get farmers paid properly, trying to improve the conditions, etc. But it's designed for basically commodity crops, and I'm not using that in a derogatory term. It doesn't really work for crops which are grown by smallholder farmers. The reason for this is the certification cost on the one hand is quite high. Now they've tried to get around this by having at the level of the cooperative, trying to deal with it there. But fair trade as well is problematic in two other ways. So first of all, the average cocoa farmer in West Africa needs $2.50 to $3 a day to live on. At the moment, if they're a man, they get paid about 80 cents a day. If they're a woman, it's about 30 cents a day. Even with a fair trade premium, it's only 20%. So that's going to get them from 80 cents a day to 96. It's not going to get them enough so that we're going to get rid of some of the child labor issues that are also associated with chocolate. You've really got to pay a little bit more and work with the farmers with more sustainable long-term issues. The second problem with fair trade, and this is a lot more tricky to explain, is something called mass balance. So for coffee, for tea, and for chocolate, there is a concept in fair trade called mass balance. Essentially what it means is that the big chocolate companies don't want to stop their lines to put special fair trade beans in, and so and then sort of start up the lines again. So what they do is they're allowed, say they make 100 tons a year, and of that 10 tons is fair trade, they can call 10% of any of their chocolate fair trade. Wow. So it's, you've got to know to read the small print when it comes around it. So look, if you're buying a banana, I always buy fair trade. With chocolate, I'm actually much more concerned that the farmer gets properly compensated with a long-term contract, gets paid the right way. There are better ways in chocolate for doing that than fair trade. And then organic, to be honest.
I think this conversation we've had about chocolates for a lot of people listening might be really eye-opening, because we've not only spoken about health benefits and the science, but also, some organic chemistry, some biology, but also environmental and ethical, quandaries that have cropped up here as well. And I think ultimately, I want to say one thing. There's some statistical correlation between chocolate consumption and Nobel Prize winners. So I think we could all do with consuming more chocolate. And I really want to thank you for coming here and taking me through the tasting, but also providing such valuable insights on chocolate. And I really think, this is worthy of several more episodes. So we'd love to have you back.
I'd love to be back, and it's been fantastic. And thank you for putting me on the spot with so many brilliant questions, but absolutely amazing. And congratulations on having the vocab. You're already there. You're already a flavor connoisseur. But, basically it tastes better. It's better for you. It's better for the farmers. It's better for the planet. Upgrade to craft chocolate. Save the planet. Save your health.
No, I'll be joining you on an in-person tasting soon. Thanks again to Spencer Hyman. Will you be substituting your usual chocolate bar for a craft bar after this? Or perhaps you plan to savor your food just a little bit more? Let me know in the comments. And make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the weekly Dr. Karan Explores podcast. And I'll see you chocolate gobblers next week.